Morning, everyone. What an amazing title for a talk, Meeting the Risen Christ. So this passage is John's recollection of the events of the first Easter. Other Gospels tell it slightly differently, with a different order of events, but we're looking at John's version this morning. So the disciples, those people who had been waiting all their lives for the Messiah, the rescuer, the one who would deliver them, as promised in what we call the Old Testament. The people who had followed Jesus for the previous few years, who each had their own story of how he called them and how they had left their jobs to follow him. The people who had seen Jesus perform miracles, turning water into wine, healing people, casting out demons, even raising people from the dead. They had heard firsthand all the stories Jesus told, all the teaching he had given, and they had been privy to his explanations of these. They had heard him talk about his death and his claim that he would return from the dead. They'd been with him when he came into Jerusalem and received the praise of the people. When this turned to cries of "Crucify him," when he was taken by the authorities, some had even been there when he was crucified. They'd gone through an awful lot with him. And here they were, scared, behind locked doors, fearful of what the future would hold, leaderless, directionless, in fear of what the authorities would do to them. Can you imagine the sense of despair, the hushed conversations, the silence, the fear, maybe most of all the sense of loss, their hoped-for future gone? Then Jesus appears. The passage says they were overjoyed to see him. I think that's probably a bit of an understatement. I suspect there was so much going on in their minds. Is this a ghost? Can you see all this too, or has grief caused me to lose my mind? Are we delusional? So what are his first words to them? Peace be with you. Words of reassurance, words designed to calm fears. So John records that he then breathed on them and they received the Holy Spirit and authority to forgive sins. These disciples living in fear, hiding from the authorities, were given authority to do what only God can do, forgive sins. In Matthew chapter 9, when Jesus heals a paralyzed man, he gets into trouble for saying the man's sins are forgiven. And now he's telling the disciples, mere men and women, that they have the same authority as God. So in some of the other accounts of the first meetings with the risen Jesus, Matthew says that he first appeared to two women whose response was to fall at his feet and worship him. Mark records that it was Mary Magdalene who first saw him, who told the others, and she wasn't believed. A mere woman, what does she know? It must have been too much for her. Now she's seeing things. That would make sense in their minds. Luke says the same, and then adds that Peter ran to the tomb to check for himself and found the clothes that Jesus had been buried in just lying there in the tomb. Luke tells the story of Jesus meeting two men on their way out of Jerusalem, and they don't recognize him until they eat together. And Jesus next appears to the rest of the disciples, and he eats something to prove that he's not a ghost. And so back to the passage. A week goes by with 10 of the disciples full of hope because they had seen Jesus, and one still doubting what has happened. Thomas had been on the journey with the others, but he wasn't there when the rest of them saw him. I love his response when they say, "You'll never guess who we've seen. Jesus, he was here in the flesh. He's not dead." I kind of imagine it as the equivalent of, "Yeah, right." I think we give Thomas a really bad time. We refer to him as doubting Thomas, as if this is a bad thing. Jesus doesn't treat him like that. He appears again when Thomas is there and makes a point of answering his specific points. Put your finger here. See the nail mark. Stop doubting and believe. You can read that last bit in two different ways as don't be silly, stop doubting, making light of Thomas's concerns, making him feel a bit silly for doubting. Or it's okay, it's true, here's your proof. Now there is no need to keep doubting. You can believe all that I said to you, all that I told you over the last 3 years. Words of reassurance. I know what I think Jesus would have said, which of those options, Given what we know of his character, from what is written about his life over the last 3 years, he was gentle with those who were truly seeking him. He explained his teaching to his disciples when they didn't understand. He saved his anger for those who tried to undermine what he was saying, who ill-treated the poor, the weak, the sick, for those who made the temple a place of oppression rather than a place of worship. That's the Jesus I know. He says to Thomas, it's okay to doubt. It's okay to ask for proof, to want to see for yourself, to not rely on the words of others to believe I'm alive. I think maybe Thomas felt a bit left out. Why did Jesus not wait until I was with the others? Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe he doesn't love me as much as he loves the others. Maybe I'm just projecting my own thoughts onto him. A bit of FOMO, a bit of not feeling good enough. Thomas had a week full of the others banging on about how amazing it was that Jesus was alive. I expect for him it was a very long week. And Jesus responds to all of this. He singles Thomas out. He deals with his doubts on a one-to-one. He treats Thomas as loved enough for Jesus to want to deal with all his questions. I wonder how long the disciples would have stayed hiding, scared, if they'd not met with the risen Christ. Would they have eventually come out and gone back to their old lives, wondering why they had done what they had been doing for the last 3 years, why they had given up everything to follow this man? Because without the resurrection, that's all that Jesus is, a man. Without the resurrection, without Christ being raised from the dead, we have no way to have a relationship with God. Without the risen Christ, we have no way of getting rid of our sin, all the stuff we've done wrong. It's with us forever. Thankfully, we don't have to face that because he is a risen Christ, and he appeared to his disciples and others to prove it to them, so that they could record it for us. Okay, so what does all that mean for us here in the 21st century, here in Chatham, here in St. John's? So last week, is it only a week ago, we celebrated Easter Sunday, the day that Jesus rose from the dead. We have a choice what to do with hearing that. As Martin talked about last week with 3 responses to the empty tomb. We can ignore him, scoff at it, say it didn't happen, maybe even laugh at those poor deluded folk that believe it. That's one option. Jesus didn't force us to believe. We were created with free will. We can listen to the Easter story and think, that's great. I'm really pleased some people believe it and do good stuff because of it. But it's not for me. That's another response. We can hear about the risen Christ and fall at his feet like the women did, like Peter did. That's a great response. Or we could say, as Thomas did, unless I see Jesus, I won't believe. I suspect many of us here today became Christians because we did exactly that. Someone told us about Jesus, and we listened to what they said and wanted to know more. I know that's my story. My best friend at school became a Christian and dragged me along to meetings, but it wasn't until I had personal experience of Jesus that I became a Christian. We're not Christians just because we're born into a so-called Christian country, or into a Christian family, or because our best friends, our partners, anyone else is a Christian. It's only when we make that decision for ourselves that anything changes. Thomas could have said, okay, you've all met the risen Jesus, so I accept what you say. But I suspect he would always have doubted whether they really had. So what is your response going to be? Are you going to reject Jesus? Say it's all a load of rubbish? Okay for those who need a crutch to get through life, but I'm stronger than that? Are you ready to make that decision to follow Jesus, to give your life to following him? That would be brilliant. Let someone know so that we can share in that joy with you. Or are you like Thomas, saying, I'll believe when I see Jesus? If that's you, then please do not leave here without talking to one of the team, who would be happy to talk and pray with you and join with you as you look into it more. The passage says, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. That's us. Jesus calls us blessed. I believe he's acknowledging how tough it is for us. We can't just wander over to Jerusalem and see Jesus. That's why it's called a step of faith. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with the film Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. There's a scene in it where Harrison Ford is looking over a deep chasm in the mountains. All he can see is a sheer drop. He's told to take a step of faith. And when he does, the camera pans to the other side of the chasm, and the viewer can see a path, brilliantly camouflaged from one side, but really clear from the other. That's how I see the step of faith in choosing to follow Jesus. For those of us on the other side, we can see the path. For those about to take the step, they can see nothing but the drop. Make today the day you choose to take that first step, but don't travel it on your own. So making the decision to follow Jesus, to come on the adventure he calls us to, is the best thing ever. It's scary, handing over all of your ambition, your lifestyle, your future. But I can vouch that anything you think you give up is replaced by something so much better, so much more enduring, so much more fun. I can tell you it's a real buzz. I don't have all the answers, but that no longer matters. I know the person who does, and that's far better. How can you not want to know him, the risen Christ?